So let me talk a little bit about new opportunities. I mentioned WRDA, the Water Resources Reform and Development Act, and it is a massive bill. I've just summarized a few key sections here that I thought you'd be interested in. What do I have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 different sections that I thought it'd be worth mentioning. So going to the first is study modernization. I mentioned that core studies need to get done in 3 years for $3 million. This is a relatively new thing. It's also a really old thing. It's what happened 30 years ago, but in the intervening time, as Congress piled more requirements on the Corps, and the Corps became more concerned to make sure it was meeting those requirements and not making mistakes, studies ballooned. As Congress doled out a little bit of money each year, they became very expensive and inefficient studies. It wasn't unusual for a study to be $20 million and take 20 years. The Corps has really ratcheted back and gotten control of that. And with some consistent funding now, they're knocking these studies out. And so you can do a 3-year, $3 million study. And I've mentioned before that there's, in essence, an RFP out right now from the Corps saying, would you like to be on the list of studies that might get considered in the future? I have the next point oddly limits to $3 million federal cost, and my only point is that the legislation says we want 3 by 3 by 3, but the federal share is $3 million, and since it's a 50-50 cost share, in theory these studies can go up to $6 million, but it requires some approvals from within the administration. If you can't do it within that period of time, you have to provide notice to the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee and the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. You can get an extension for an extra year if you need it. It's really more difficult for 3 years, and 7 years is the max. If you hit 7 years, the study's done. So Congress is supporting the Corps and saying these have to be faster. And then there are requirements for reporting to Congress after 18 months and after 4 years saying how studies are going. So the study modernization is good news for local sponsors because it allows you to know that the study will not take forever and it will not be as costly as it used to be. Again, though, you have to look at, does the study make sense in your area? Are the benefits there to justify the cost of the study, or are you unlikely to ever qualify for federal dollars and you should do it yourself or in partnership with the state? Section 1004 does Section 408 expediting. Again, Section 408 is permission from the Army Corps to touch a federal levy and make modifications to it. If it's not a federal levy you're dealing with, no problem. If it is, I guess I wouldn't say problem, but I would say complicated, longer process. Section 1004 of WRDA provides some reform on 408 permitting. My opinion is it doesn't do as much as it could do, but really Congress can say whatever it wants. The reality is 408 permitting can be really fast if you're working with a core district that really wants to partner with you on it and is all about figuring out how to make it happen. And if you, as the applicant, have great communication with the Corps, if you're meeting with them regularly, if you don't plop an application down on their desk and say, okay, here it is, if you're meeting with them in advance and talking about what's going to be in it, the process can be a lot smoother. Section 1018 is in-kind contribution. I talked about the credit concept. Do work locally, have the dollars you spend count as a credit towards work which the Army Corps might do in the future. And there were some provisions modified on crediting in WRDA. This was work that the National Coalition that I mentioned pushed for in a number of our visits to DC, trying to make it clear how this would work and make sure that it really was going to incentivize local communities to do that work and not have to sit around waiting, not knowing when it would be that the Corps might be able to step in. Transfer of excess credit is an interesting concept that showed up in this WRDA. And perhaps the easiest example is let's say Multnomah County Drainage District, which has a project now, let's say it seeks to do that project and it does some advanced construction and then the Army Corps comes along and you end up stranding credit. So let's say it's a $100 million project and the locals spend $50 million and the Corps comes and spends 50, and if the cost share is 65, 35 local, 65 fed, then the locals will have spent an extra $15 million, and that's stranded credit. Well, Section 1020 says, with permission, you can move that credit to a different project completely. And so this is really important from a statewide perspective, because what it requires is that there be a comprehensive plan of how credit will get moved around. And that's a unique role that the state of Oregon can play. because the state of Oregon can say, well, let's coordinate how local districts are doing this. And so if there is excess credit, let's make sure we're not stranding it. Let's make sure we're moving it to the communities that need it. Again, that's something only the state really can do. Section 1043A and B are the last two provisions I'm going to talk about, I believe. And these are pilot programs. The same model exists of you do a feasibility study and then you do construction. But Congress said, we want to see what happens if we get the locals to do all the work and the Corps consults through the process. So you might say, how is this different from the locals just doing it? Well, the difference is the federal government's still cost sharing on this. And there is no guidance out on how this is going to work yet. My guess is that guidance will be out in the next year or so. And essentially what the program here is if you are in a position to advance a feasibility study and you want to do the work and be a pilot to see how it is to do the study yourself with the Corps partnering with you and watching you and giving advice to you, or if there's an authorized project and you want to construct it and use the federal dollars and say to the Corps, can you oversee us and see what we do? This could be a very interesting opportunity. I can't tell you more about it than that because there is no guidance out on it yet.